twee groot finansiële maatskappye het hulle verpligte inentingsbeleide onlangs geskraap. Dit kom ook na toenemende druk deur vakbonde wat sê niemand mag hulle werk verloor omdat hulle inentings weier nie. Hoe moet ons oor die regsgronde vir verpligte inentings dink nou dat die pandemie geëindig het? Adv Mark Oppenheimer is nie net regskenner nie, maar bied ook die potsending constitutional landmarks aan. Mark, so last year, the private sector announced vaccine mandates with big fanfare, and now this year we're seeing two big companies making kind of a U-turn. Why?
So I think part of it is because the facts on the ground have changed. If you think about the nature of the pandemic at the time and the view that vaccines would be very useful in limiting transmission, the view was we should try and encourage people to take it, and one way to do that is to make sure that companies play their role. Of course, there's a countervailing value, which is that you've got constitutional rights, and you have a right to bodily integrity, for example. So the idea that you should be able to control what happens in your body is a fundamental right. That dignity is, one of the foundational rights, as is freedom. And so the idea that you can force people to do things to their body against their choice seems rather extreme. You have to have a very, very good reason for doing it. I think what we're seeing now is that the pandemic has largely petered out, that the efficacy of vaccines for stopping transmission doesn't appear to be the case anymore with Omicron. And so there is no good rational basis for enforcing it.
Are there legal grounds still, do you think, for enforcing a vaccine mandate?
Well, we must think about where the mandate comes from. So if you have a mandate from the state, it's got to respect constitutional rights, but it has some leeway. So Section 36 of our Constitution allows for reasonable limitations for laws of general application. So there you've got to show that it's justifiable in an open and democratic country. Now we know that some countries around the world have adopted vaccine mandates. You've also got to show that there's a rational link between the mandate and the thing that you're trying to stop, namely the spread of COVID. If you can't show that, then it must fail. But if it's done by the private sector, they're not issuing laws of general application. So those constitutional rights are much harder to defeat. And so what you then have, there's a recent case in the CCMA where someone was fired on the basis that they refused to take the vaccine. They'd had a reaction to a flu vaccine that was negative 10 years before. And they said, they were uncomfortable doing this and they were fired. So they went to the CCMA and they were awarded R250,000 compensation on the basis that it was unconstitutional to have fired this person on this basis. And that adjudicator says that the private sector must respect people's constitutional rights and that it doesn't have the government defense of reasonable limitations because it's not producing laws of general application. But having said that, we could imagine a variety of different companies that upfront tell people, if you want to work here, these are the conditions. And if people agree to it, you might say, well, then there's a waiving of your rights. I think we didn't have that with vaccine mandates. What you had was people who'd been employed and worked for long periods of time, and this was imposed after the fact, and you weren't really obtaining their agreement.
You talk about that CCMA case. Is that a precedent-setting case?
Yes and no. So the CCMA is an arbitration tribunal. It sits lower than the Labour Court, but it does set a certain norm. So other commissioners will take notice of that. There are many other people who are going to be placed in a similar situation. And it is a written reasoned judgment. So it might be the kind of thing that we talk about as presumptively binding. Other courts might look at it and say, I can see influence from this even if I don't have to follow it.
So what role should the latest scientific findings play when cases like these are adjudicated in our courts?
Absolutely vital. That especially when you're tampering with people's fundamental human rights, you have to have a very good reason to do that tampering. And so if it was the case before that widespread use of vaccines was going to limit the transmission, which would have saved lives, you then at least have something rational on the table. You have to decide whether it's proportionate, whether it's still justifiable, you've still got rights that matter, but at least you had some benefit that you could obtain. Once that benefit disappears, then you're just infringing on people's rights. And that can't be justified. I think there was also a hope that vaccines would be the way out of the pandemic, and undoubtedly they've played a role, but a number of other factors have played a role too. There's natural immunity, and then there's a weakening in the nature of the disease. So if we compare the infection fatality rate of something like Omicron to the original COVID, it's a dramatic difference. Ultimately, the value that you care about is saving lives, and if your measures aren't going to do that anymore, well, then they must be abandoned.
So some would make the case for vaccine mandate, given that we do have a new variant and it's highly transmissible, so they say. But we also know that the vaccine does not 100% stop transmission.
Well, as far as I understand, it's not anywhere near 100%. So you could take a view, which is that what you're trying to do is have a variety of measures in place to save lives. And not all of those measures will be 100% useful, but the combination of them will get you somewhere. But if the combination of the measures doesn't do anything, then they must be abandoned. We've now abandoned masks. I think it's been known for a while that masks weren't particularly useful for stopping Omicron. They may have been useful for prior variants, but for Omicron they weren't. And so then what you have is an enormous infringement on people's personal liberties, and that has thankfully been abandoned. The last time that I was in the studio, there was a curfew. Now, it's strange to think that there was a nationally imposed bedtime on South Africa for over a year. For what purpose? We have no idea. The government has used a range of irrational measures to take away people's freedoms, and thank goodness civil society has fought the good fight and got those freedoms back.
Just shortly, which constitutional lessons do you think we've learned during the pandemic?
I think we've learned that the Constitution has stayed in effect during this time. We never declared a state of emergency. We had the state of disaster. I think there was a reluctance in some sectors to push back against the government, especially in business sectors. If we think about one of the early bans that was in place was a ban on e-commerce. And you'd expect companies like Takealot to be fighting the good fight so they could keep their businesses going. They weren't. It was civil society organizations that had those fights. But our judges were incredibly receptive, that cases could be heard on an urgent basis, that a lot of challenges were very successful. And you had a reason afterwards as well to get a sense of why you won or you lost. And I think that's very important for the public to have a sense that this isn't done by a decree, this isn't done irrationally, this is done because someone has applied their minds to it. And I think we found that often in the case of decisions from the bench, not always the case from decisions from government.
Certainly not. Mark, thanks so much.